Professor Ball, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and welcome to the show.
Thank you.
This whole issue of, I'd like to be able to call it the climate debate, but of course we can't because it's more of a narrative, a story, than a genuine debate, if only it were a debate. But it strikes me as being a very, very important issue these days. Over in the States, we have the Green New Deal being proposed, the Paris Climate Accord, of course. And it's not far from any news broadcast over here in the UK. It's difficult, rarely a day goes past without the BBC or other mainstream news organisations dropping in some oblique reference to climate change being a problem. Professor Ball, I know that you've explained the key facts of climate change many places before, but what do you think are the most salient points if we are to make any progress, if you like, in winning minds over in rational discussions? Where do you think the focus needs to be aimed?
Well, the first problem is that under the hysterical use of environment for control, there's no hope of a rational discussion. The minute you say, look, human-caused global warming is not an issue, you're done. People just throw you out the window. And so we're not at the point yet where we can have rational discussion about climate change or anything to do with the environment. The environment, of course, and climate change. These are the perfect vehicles for political agendas. They show you care about the planet and you're saving the children's future and all the rest of the nonsense. And yet virtually nobody who does these things knows anything about what they're talking about. And of course, then the public don't know anything either.
No.
I mean, they did a study in the United States of over 2,000 people, and they did it at a grade 10 level, basically like a grade 10 test, high school test. And 77% got D or F on the test. And yet they're the most basic questions about climate. And it's sort of like that old thing about, well, the weather, everybody talks about it, but, nobody does anything about it. I say everybody talks about it, but nobody knows what they're talking about. My credentials start with empirical practice first, because I was in the Canadian Air Force. And, of course, in flying, you have weather forecasting. And I flew 4 years over the North Atlantic anti-submarine patrol, and then 5 years in the Arctic, Canadian Arctic search and rescue. And I lost my flying category because of hearing loss. I got out of the military, got a small amount of cash, and decided to go back to university to try to figure out why the weather forecasting was so bad. How had it not improved since it began 250 years ago? In fact, they were better in those days. The Farmer's Almanac is a far better weather forecaster than any government agency. After those 9 years in the military, as I said, I went back to university to try and find out why forecasting was so bad. The first thing I did was I went to the University of East Anglia, to the Climatic Research Unit, which now has been completely perverted to a political vehicle.
Indeed.
But when it was founded originally by Hubert Lamb, and Lamb had gone through the same thing I had gone through, and that is that he was a weather forecaster during the war, and the pilots were coming back and saying, your forecasting is terrible, and in fact, he told me a story about he'd given a forecast of clear skies, and the crews came back, and one of the bomber pilots walked into his office and dumped a huge block of ice on his weather map and said, "There's your clear skies." So what he did after the war was that he set up the Climatic Research Unit in order to investigate why weather forecasting was so bad. As I said, it's been hijacked for political agenda ever since. But what he was trying to do was what I set out to do. You can't understand the weather if you don't know the pattern of the weather in the past, and then from that pattern you can start looking at what the mechanisms and the causes of weather and weather changes are. So Lamb's objective was to to create as many long-term weather records as he possibly could. Now, I did the same thing in Canada here. The Hudson Bay Company had a record starting in about 1712, and because they were dependent upon the environment, both for survival, because they needed to the rabbits and the hare and deer and so on, they lived off the land, but also for their economy, the furs. Mm-hmm. And so and also the governors realized that if you're going to keep a daily journal, the one thing that you can put in it is the daily weather. Yep. So they set up a technique which was taken directly from science, on which was the marine logs, how to accurately record the weather from day to day. And I took that 350 years of weather record and reconstructed the weather changes in central Canada. And of course, what you see is tremendous change, and change going on all of the time. Change is normal, and rapid change is normal. And so this argument that, somehow the weather is changing and it's never done that before, absolute nonsense. But this is, of course, one of the ways that you can get attention for yourself and get all the research funding and so on. Yep. And so, as I said, when you look at the long-term weather records, you see that what's going on right now is perfectly normal, well within any variability that's occurred in the last 30, 50, or even 1,000 years. And in fact, just to put that in perspective, they're saying how warm it is. It's going to be 2 degrees Celsius warmer in the next 40 years. It's been 2 degrees warmer than today for 9,000 of the last 10,000 years.
Yeah, there are many facts like this on there that are completely overlooked. So essentially, in this narrative, there, yes, climate changes. I mean, when we have phrases like climate denier bandied around, it just starts to get silly, doesn't it? And as you mentioned, rational debate impossible. But without being a climate expert, I've done sufficient reading. I worked as an airline pilot and studied meteorology. That's my brief, limited qualifications. But climate changes, doesn't it? I mean, climate is changing weather. So surely we can overcome, yes, climate changes, and yes, there's been some warming, hasn't there? I mean, I think it's debatable as to whether it's tailed off now. And yes, CO2 is a greenhouse gas. So there are some things that we would have to say, yes, these things are true, but there's a huge but, isn't there? I mean, one of the first ones that springs to mind is CO2 driving climate?
Well, of course, this is, as Shakespeare said, even the devil can quote the scriptures in his arguments. As you know from your brief experience, you dealt with weather, and most people don't know the difference between weather and climate, right? Weather is what you experience when you stand outside. And it's the sum total of everything from cosmic radiation in deep space to heat coming out of the bottom of the oceans. And so it's a totality that you feel. Climate is the average of that weather, how that weather changes over time. So you get 24 hours, that's the climate for the day. Yeah. And again, most people don't realize the difference with those two things. The climate changes and has always changed, and it changes quite dramatically. What's going on right now is well within natural variability. There's really nothing unusual about it at all. And that's the thing that people have to be educated to. Yep. But of course, if you want to get research funds, get attention, get published, the more sensational you can make something. Unfortunately, that's the way it works today. It's not about good, rational, sensible science.
No. One of the things that really strikes me up front is the fact that it has been a lot warmer than it is today. And for me, for anyone, this should pull the rug out from beneath any concern that it's getting too warm. If it's been considerably warmer, if there have been atmospheric levels of CO2 that are far higher than the 400 parts per million that we currently have, how come we still have alarm bells ringing?
Well, because there are people that are exploiting it for research and for funding and alarmism and create stories. That's the sad part about it. It's, as I said, the thing that annoys me, and in one of my books, I say, look, I'm outraged that after 40 years, people have hijacked my discipline to create sensationalism.
Yeah.
And of course, how do you calm that down? Unfortunately, we're in this period of environmentalism, and I think this is a very important point to get across. People work on paradigms. Societies work on paradigms. A paradigm is how they look at a particular segment of the society, how it functions, how they think about it. And then academics will talk about paradigm shifts. So every once in a while, some new idea comes along, and it changes how people view things.
Yeah.
I mean, two of them in the 20th century, paradigm shifts were or introduced new ones. Feminism, right, was a very distinct, different way of looking at the whole half of the world. And then, of course, environmentalism was another. Yeah. Before 1950, nobody even talked about the environment. Yeah. It wasn't even an issue. And what happens with a new paradigm is that somebody says, well, look, maybe we should look at the world this way. And other people then look at it and say, yeah, that's a very interesting perspective on the world. And initially about 10 or 15% grab it. They grab it and then exploit it either for power or for money or both. Then the majority of the people looking at it, like feminism as an example, and say, well, yeah, we really do need to make those kind of changes. There's some interesting things there. And so then the majority get on board, but then alarm bells start to ring and people start to say, well, hang on a minute, how far do we go with this? How far do we take this new feminism or this new environmentalism? And one of the things that I've dealt with all my career is alarmists.
Yeah.
What's their role in society? And I finally realized that their job is to define the limits for the rest of us. So we're saying, okay, feminism, good thing, the women adapting it and so on. But then, suddenly these women start burning bras. And the rest of the women say, no, now I know the limit. Sorry, I need that. I need that comfort. And so the alarmist's role is to define the limit of a new paradigm for us. And that's what's going on with environment now.
There are some important caveats with environmentalism, because it seems to me that the standard of good for the environmentalist is an untouched planet. It's a sort of a don't step on the grass policy for environmentalism, which leaves no space for human activity. Exactly. We've all got to back off and leave this lovely planet as a wilderness. But where do humans fit into that? And others such as Alex Epstein, I'm sure you've maybe familiar with him, are sort of questioning this environmentalist assumption that the good is an untouched planet, because really we should be chasing a good, more aimed at human flourishment, and how, of course, can we minimize pollution, which is a very legitimate concern.
As I said, environmentalism is a new way of looking at the world, and it's got some good to it, but there's some downsides to it. But here's the answer to your question. Notice that environmentalism, as it's exploited by the Greens and these people that want to take total control of the world, and you're right about the clean planet. There were bumper stickers a few years ago that said, "Save the planet, kill yourself." Yeah. Right? But that raises the whole issue that is underlying what you're saying, but nobody ever talks about. Why do they talk about humans as different than any other animal? I've got as much right to be on this planet as any other animal. But somehow they look at us as different. We're not part of nature. But we're very much a part of nature. And so if once you start with the assumption that people are not supposed to be here, we're different. And this gets into the whole philosophical thing that went on in the 19th century about the role of humans, and John Locke and all these people talking about this. This is the whole issue underlying all of this, is the assumption that people shouldn't be on the planet.
This kind of leads into the issue of the agenda. There has to be an agenda behind any systematic misrepresentation of the truth. What can you tell us about that, Professor Ball?
Well, the environment has been used by other dictators and world leaders before, because it's the perfect vehicle of control.
Yeah.
That's why we always talk about, oh, Chicken Little, the sky is falling. That's the greatest threat to humans. And so anybody that talks about environment is really talking about controlling people and their behavior and what they do. And we've hinted at that in those people that say, well, there shouldn't be any humans on the planet. And I agree with that. Well, I'll start with getting rid of you. That'll be the first group to go. But these are fundamental questions that people need to think about with regard to how they're being bullied by people that use the environment. That you're destroying the environment and you're destroying my world, and you have no right to do it. And therefore I can tell you how to live, what you can do, and how you must behave. It's the ultimate in control, as I said. And Mao Zedong did it. Hitler did it, all of the Stalin, they were all into using the environment for political control.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it, when we hear words like consensus, which is obviously a political term, it's not a scientific term.
Right.
And the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or whatever it is, these are political bodies. And to hear, when I hear this phrase, the science is settled, I just sort of hear a door slamming to inquiry. It seems to me to be a phrase that's designed to shut off any tendency for a listener to raise a question in his mind. Oh, science is settled. Okay, well, forget it. Don't ask any questions. Yeah. You might as well say, don't ask questions.
Yeah. And of course, that's what they want. That's why I said environment has been through history the perfect vehicle for total control of the people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it gives you mentioned it gives people a feel-good factor. Everybody gets to sort of virtue signal and show that they care and all that. How do we manage to? I mean, you've mentioned at the beginning that rational debate is impossible. But if we have the facts of reality that CO2 is extremely unlikely to be the control knob of the environment, as it were, it's a greenhouse gas. It's a small composition of greenhouse gases. How can we? Where do you think we can go, Professor Ball, with taking this argument and combating the mass irrationality and the bunching us all in as climate deniers and all this sort of nonsense, which isn't talking about the facts. Because one of the things that I see is that it's in all our interest to find the truth. And if we really want to know the truth, we have to welcome people sort of making our theories and ideas wrong, effectively. Where do you think we can go?
Well, of course, that was something that I fought throughout my career as a teacher, was to get students to ask questions. They're all, they're all dumbed down by they've asked a question in high school and got shot down, or they've watched other people shot down. And I used to work very, very hard to even get them to ask questions in my class. And of course, part of the reason is that most teachers and most people talking about things don't know what they're talking about and don't want questions because they know they can't answer them and they're going to look stupid. And so that's the first problem. The second problem is to know that Earth Day, which is really when all of this environmental movement began, was April 22nd, 1972. And it was chosen by Paul Ehrlich. And guess what April 22nd is? It's the birthday of Vladimir Lenin. The message that Ehrlich was sending surreptitiously to his leftist friends was, hey, we're going to use this earth and this environment for total control of the society. That's where it began. And of course, Ehrlich then set about creating the science that he needed to back up his political agenda. And that's what's going on at the UN, where you've got the Agenda 21, which is the political, Maurice Strong, who was a devout socialist, he set up the political agenda of Agenda 21, where governments will control everything. Then a subset of that was the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. Mm-hmm. They set up the IPCC, this Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And let me explain to you how narrowly they did it.
Go on.
They gave them the definition of climate change. Now, I need to step outside of what we're talking about here a little bit to come back to it. I used to think commissions of inquiry were great. This was the perfect. Finally, we're getting the politics out of the issue. Let's get the experts in there and we'll have a proper inquiry. I thought that until I was appointed to the first commission of inquiry, which was dispute over a lake in Manitoba. As soon as I got the terms of reference from the politician, I realized that the terms of reference were telling me or predetermining the outcome. Okay, so I went back to the politician and said, "You give me access to everything, or I'm going to go to the news people and say you're trying to limit what I can look at." I couldn't even get the data I needed to study the problem,
Okay.
and I remember, you go look at the internet, which of course has become the perfect vehicle for conspiracy theories. The biggest one still out there is who killed Kennedy, right? But they had the Warren Commission. Well, I watched Justice Warren being interviewed before he died, and they said to him, "Well, Justice Warren, why didn't you look at Jack Ruby and the mafia connection in Dallas?" And he very calmly said, "It wasn't in my terms of reference."
Okay, so the terms of reference are narrowed right down, and thus the debate's controlled right from the front. Yeah.
Right. Yes. So everybody thinks, oh, great, the politicians have put it into the hands of the Commission of Inquiry, but they then tell the Commission of Inquiry what they can and cannot look at. Right. That's how they control it. And it's a perfect vehicle because the media go to the politicians and say, well, what are you? Oh, I can't talk till the commission's finished its work. I can't talk. It's the perfect vehicle for the politician, where everybody thinks, no, it's taking it out of the hands of the politician completely. In fact, it's putting total control of it in the hands of the politician. That's the way these people play these games. And so, yeah. And that's what I want people to think about that with every single government of commission. Go and look at the terms of reference. How have they written them to control and dictate what the commission can look at? And there you will see the real answer to what's going on. And so that's true, of course, what happened with the United Nations. And it was Maurice Strong who wrote the terms of reference for the IPCC.
Yeah.
Well, everybody thinks that the IPCC is looking at all climate change. They're not. They're only looking at human causes of climate change, right? Which narrows it down to virtually nothing. You don't include the sun because humans don't affect the sun. And yet the sun is the major control of climate.
So let me get this right. The IPCC only looks at the human factors that it says or it considers can affect climate. And we, of course, we know that there are well, you know, perhaps you can reiterate the fact that there are many factors driving climate, aren't they? It's a hugely complex thing, and so to single out just the human caused bits or the bits that might cause anything, that seems massively disingenuous.
Well, you can't possibly identify the human causes if you don't understand natural causes, and we don't. So if we understood natural causes, weather forecasting would be perfect every time. So that's a very interesting part of this whole thing. Science can be defined in one word: prediction. If you can't predict, you don't have science.
So I guess by that you're referring to the scientific method and the necessity to replicate a situation and to demonstrate through experiments that you can predict an outcome. Is that what you mean?
Well, that's partly it. The scientific method is more a matter of how you advance knowledge. The scientific method is that a scientist hypothesizes. A scientist says, well, in his head, he said, well, if this and this is true, which are assumptions, then this is true. But then immediately you come out with that hypothesis and its assumptions, other scientists start challenging it. And they try, in proper scientific method, they try to disprove the hypothesis. Yeah. But what's gone on with the climate issue is they've come out and said, CO2 increases, the temperature increases, and CO2 will increase because humans are producing more of it. Fact, given, not tested, not proven, not challenged. And when people like me come along and say, well, hang on a minute, CO2 is only 4% of all the greenhouse gases. What about water vapor? It's 95%. And all of these factors, see, that's how they narrowed it, by terms of reference and by the definition that they were given. So the IPCC only look at human causes of climate change. And by the way, so CO2 is number one. Water vapor, I've just mentioned, it's by far the largest greenhouse gas, 95% of the effect. But here's how they get around it. Humans produce water vapor. You see the chimneys and the steam coming out of them. That's water vapor going to the atmosphere. But they say, the amount that humans produce relative to the total amount in the atmosphere is so small that we ignore it. Right? And yet water vapor in the atmosphere has only got to change by 1 or 2%. That equals all the CO2 that any humans could put up. So by taking these definitions and defining them in a way that they want to predetermine the outcome, that's exactly what they've done at the IPCC.
Yeah. I mean, you could similarly argue, of course, that CO2 is such a tiny slice that, it's just, it can't possibly be driving climate, as I've heard you say in other places. Yeah. So, Professor Ball, what do you think are the implications of where this is going? Currently, we're on this crazy train ride, and we've come from the Paris Accord, and we've got all these political bodies set up over here in the UK. We've got low emission zones in London. We've got taxation set up to accommodate this alleged need for CO2 reductions. We've got huge things all in place. Where is it going if these targets are actually, if they were met? I mean, reducing CO2 emissions by 50% by goodness knows when, it keeps changing, doesn't it? And there's always pressure to make the targets more stringent. Where do you see the whole thing playing out?
Well, one of the things is, when you look at any government that has been forced to look at adopting policy for dealing with climate change, they've avoided the issue completely. What they do, and I'll give you the perfect example. The American government under Clinton signed the Kyoto Protocol, and of course, once the American government signs a treaty, then it has to be approved by the Senate. So the Kyoto Protocol treaty went to the Senate, and the senators looked at it and said, this is nuts. This is going to completely destroy our economy and our jobs and everything else. And for what? And so what they did was typical and actually quite clever political trick. They said, we're not going to vote up or down on the Kyoto Protocol. What we're going to do is create a whole new resolution, and it's called the Byrd-Hagel Resolution, and people can look it up for themselves, BYRD/Hagel, Hagel. The Byrd-Hagel Resolution said, should we vote on the Kyoto Protocol? They then had a whole debate about whether they should vote on the Kyoto Protocol. And they ended up voting 95-0 not to vote on the Kyoto Protocol.
Right.
Now, why? When you go and look at the debate, and it's all available on the internet, the Senate debate on it, and it's actually a very, very informative thing to read, because what they said was, okay, if we reduce CO2, what is it going to cost us? What's the cost in jobs, economy, and so on? And then if we reduce, how much can we reduce CO2, and what effect would that have in terms of reducing global warming? Well, they ended up finding out that it was going to cost trillions of dollars, huge harm on the economy, to reduce global temperatures by 0.47 degrees Celsius by the year 2050. You say, well, this is crazy. This is the cost benefit of this. So that's what they were really doing. But as I said, they didn't want to be seen voting against the Kyoto Protocol.
No.
So they cleverly. Now, this is what a lot of governments are doing.
The nettle that needs to be grasped is that it would devastate any economy to sort of to reduce our dependency on fossil fuels to the extent that's being called for would mean that aeroplanes stop flying, air transport would grind to a halt, shipping, infrastructure. I mean, you can't have a modern economy, running on renewable energy or unreliables, as Alex Epstein calls them. If the sun goes down and the wind drops, then society comes to a grinding halt. I don't understand how. I mean, well, I can understand it, but the implications are huge, aren't they? The implications are a massive contraction in economic activity, surely.
Oh, absolutely. And of course, that when politicians are confronted with this, that's what they have to look at. So they have to find a way around the pressure from the environmentalists and, oh, you don't care about the planet or the future, and come up with some real economic, social, and that's why I say that's what the American Senate did with the Kyoto Protocol, and that's what's going on now. What is it going to cost us, and what is the return on that? And of course, as I said, when you look at it, it doesn't make any sense. But the other thing that's making people come to their senses is in society. I talked about earlier about paradigm shifts. Environment was a new paradigm. And it came in and everybody said, oh, yeah, great, save the world, save the planet, this is wonderful. But now we're at the point where we're starting to look at, well, what's the real cost of this? And what's the real benefit of this? So once you put it out into the marketplace and you start to see, for example, alternate energies, the reality of them is now coming home. When the sun doesn't shine and the winds don't blow, as you said, and then what do you do? How do you store energy? If you really wanted to improve the energy problem, if you could invent a way of storing energy, you could make yourself $1 trillion. But the only thing we've got are batteries, which are incredibly inefficient and expensive, and not on any scale that could work, even for a small town. And then the other way is, and there are some communities where when they're producing surplus energy, they'll use that to pump water uphill. That then becomes a potential energy that you can then use later on. But that's about the only place where there's any way that you can modify or store energy. So wind and solar are completely collapsing. And the cost in terms of noise, in terms of damage to the environment, in terms of the birds getting killed and everything else. These are real. Actually, ironically, they're good things. It's good that they're collapsing.
I'm a little bit. I'm a bit of a free marketeer personally. I think the free market can solve a lot of problems. But unfortunately, we don't have one. And we have these huge subsidies for all these industries, don't we? Which sort of really skews the playing field. But one thing that really shocks me is that the environmental lobby would also have us shut down nuclear power stations and even hydroelectric power stations, which really does beg the question, where the hell's anyone's energy going to come from? I mean, it does sort of point to a return to the Dark Ages, which I think most people just have no ability to see these implications of where this is going, and it worries me.
That's why I said at the beginning of our discussion that anybody that is using the environment in total or in part is all about political control. It's not about saving the planet or preventing pollution or anything else. It's all about controlling the people. And so that's gradually coming to the fore. And as I said, when governments that have tried or say that they're going to go green, I mean, look at all the countries in Europe that have tried to adapt. Look at Spain, where they got to the point where it was costing them $700,000 for each job in order to save the environment. And so the realities are starting to hit home. And of course, the other side of the reality is that people are starting to realize that humans have every right to be here. We have every right to do what we're doing. we're no different than, like, when we build a dam. How is that different than a beaver building a dam? The beaver builds the dam for heat and energy and food supply in the winter. Well, that's exactly what we do it for. And so this whole environmental paradigm is starting to be confronted. And for a time, as I said, there was a period there where you didn't dare say anything. Oh, you don't care about the environment. Now it's changing, and that's how paradigms change.
Yeah.
That gradually, as the public start to feel the impact of them, the implications to their society, and you're seeing studies done now. As I said, the U.S. Senate just did another one. Okay, if we implement all of this Paris Climate Agreement, what's the return on that investment for us?
Yeah. But the other thing is, I mean, it's all sort of on its head, isn't it? Because if we care for the environment, we'd want plants to grow more abundantly. We'd want to be able to feed people. There's always hoo-ha. James Lovelock apparently saying we need another 2 or 3 planets or whatever it was. He was claiming something along those lines some years ago. But if CO2 actually is greening the planet, it's I've heard from several sources that it's, and even the NASA photographs show that the planet is significantly greened over the last 35, 40 years of our additional CO2 that we're pumping into the atmosphere. This means that plants can grow significantly better. It means that we're much better. So this whole presumption of being anti-environment, if we're questioning some of the fundamental assumptions of this climate disaster, imminent man-made climate disaster narrative, it's not actually true, is it? Because if we sucked all the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, I mean, please correct me if I'm wrong, Professor. If we reduced the atmospheric CO2 down to, I believe Patrick Moore, ex-Greenpeace, said around about 150 parts per million, plants would die. So if we turn that on its head, putting more CO2 out could actually be a good thing, assuming it doesn't cause any runaway warming scenario.
Yeah, but what's wrong with a warmer world? I mean, all you hear about people should go back into from 1940 to 1980, the world was cooling down. And when I started studying it, the consensus was global cooling. Go and look at the reports done by the CIA during that time. I've got 2 of them on my shelves there, where they're looking at the impact of global cooling and the reduction of food production, social unrest because of starvation, and so on and so forth. Cooling is a much, much greater threat. And even in a warmer world, more people still die from the cold than die from warm every year, even in England. And so, but you see, they create these ideas, and that becomes the what they sell the people on, and the whole thing is to re-educate the people and say, look, you've been sold a bill of goods on environment. I happen to think that the bigger problem is that they're telling people so many lies, providing so much misinformation, because there isn't a single bit of evidence to support any of the environmental claims. Desertification, deforestation, there's no evidence for any of it. No. And when the public find that out, they're going to throw it out. And my concern is then issues that we do need to deal with won't get dealt with. Yep. That's the danger of crying wolf on a global scale.
Absolutely. There was an issue recently here over in Channel 4 News in the UK. They're trying to pin extinction to the CO2 issue. And I think there is legitimate concern about some extinctions, but as you look deeper into the story, we see that it's actually farming practices that are far more likely to be guilty of extinction. Things like rising density of electromagnetic fields and pulse and microwave radiation. Things like the massive use of glyphosate on the environment. These are huge factors causing extinction. And again, we see the muddied waters where somehow climate change is blamed for extinction. And obviously, people out there have heard of the Extinction Rebellion kicking off. What do you say to these extinction alarmists?
Well, extinction is normal. It's gone on for all of history. Get over it. Just hope it's not your group that goes extinct, right? And so this is, again, go back to the fundamentals. Go back to what are the balances of nature, the forces of nature, the energy, and how have you look at the whole history of plants and animals. I mean, for example, we were talking about CO2. Right now, they're in a panic about 400 parts per million. But for the last 300 million years, the average level of CO2 was 1,200 parts per million. And one of the reasons that we know, well, we know that from the geologic record, but plants function best with 1,200 parts per million. And we know that because commercial greenhouses pump that level of CO2 in to increase the yields by a factor of 4.
Yeah.
So that you could argue, and I know Patrick Moore doesn't say it in quite these terms, but you could say that at 400 parts per million, the plants are malnourished. Yep. And certainly at 150 parts per million, they would virtually all be dead. So really, the ideal level for the last 300 million years has been 1,200 parts per million. And by the way, just to put that in perspective, there's no relationship between temperature and CO2. 432 million years ago, there was an ice age, the Ordovician Ice Age, and the CO2 levels were 4,500 parts per million in an ice age. Yeah. So this whole and by the way, the other thing that's critical, we mentioned CO2 only 4% of the greenhouse gases, but in every record we've got, including the 800,000 year Antarctic ice core record, the temperature changes before the CO2, not as they assume. They assume, oh, CO2 changes, temperature will increase. All of the records we've got show it's exactly the opposite. The temperature changes before the CO2. And so it's completely based upon false. But this is the exploitation of environment and control of people. And as I said, the fact that Hitler used it was enough for me to worry about its use.
It's a shame that, education, I'm sure, is as poor quality mainstream education here in the United Kingdom as it is in Canada and the States. And people seem to fall for the classic sort of appeal to authority. Just because everybody else believes it, I'll believe it. Or just because, alleged authority figures are all saying it, I'll believe it. And it's even an appeal to emotion, isn't it? It's sort of pulling at your emotional strings. Are you a climate denier, or are you trying to save the planet? Of course, everyone wants to identify with saving the planet and not destroying it. So we've got a complete inability to really follow a reasoned argument, haven't we? We've got a population who are they're going to listen to the mainstream news broadcasts, but they're not actually ever going to follow through a reasoned argument about why any of the presented conclusions are true. And it seems to be a major characteristic of the mainstream narrative is always to present assertions and conclusions. I mean, I've never heard any reasoning at all in the mainstream narrative. So this is another thing that we're hugely up against, isn't it, Professor Ball? If we're trying to get truth out there, if we're trying to sort of metaphorically shake people by the shoulders a little to get them to think and arrive at truth, we've really got our work cut out, haven't we?
Well, to some extent, but one of the things, and I kind of let go of this a little bit for a while, but I'm back at it again. There is a huge well of common sense in the ordinary people. They don't necessarily understand something, but they intuitively know whether it's right or wrong. And you see that with polls right now. For example, a poll of 10 million people done in 8 nations by the United Nations. And they asked them to list 16 of their concerns, socioeconomic concerns. Climate change is dead last. It's not. It's 16th out of 16. So they say, yeah, okay, but it really have no concern to me. Yeah. I would also take not take issue with you, but challenge. We don't have an education system. We have an indoctrination system. Yep. That's where the problem is. And I can tell you, talking to the young people, they are not buying into it. They are simply not buying into it. And part of it is, ironically, because this is the generation, for the first time in history, that have grown up with all of those advertisements on television of this super duper toy. And when they buy it, it's just another piece of plastic shit. And so they are increasing, very healthily skeptical
Yeah.
about anything that they hear or are told.
Yeah.
And you see that. I mean, I spoke to a grade 12 class in Abbotsford the other day, and they are very cynical about it all. They you know, I said, well, you know, how many of you are going to be how many of you are not going to have jobs when you grow up? And they just said, no, you're joking. That's all rubbish from the government and people that want to control us. So these young people are a whole different breed.
That's very encouraging, and thank you for correcting me there on the educational system. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
I find it, you know, when we see Greta Thunberg wheeled out there to deliver some nonsense in front of the UN, it does seem to appeal to some of the youngsters. You know, I know from watching my own 13-year-old niece, who sits up and takes notice of this stuff. I mean, bless her, she is actually a thinking young person, and she seems to be grappling with these issues, and it is encouraging to see young people cutting through, you know, this hefty swathe of propaganda.
Well, the first thing is Greta Thunberg. That's the worst case of child abuse in the world history, and that's September 20th when they trotted her out before the UN. And here's a 16-year-old girl with Asperger's syndrome, obsessive compulsive disorder, and autistic. And her sister, by the way, is also autistic. And here's the mother who wrote a book on climate that nobody read. So she's exploiting her daughter. I think that is they should be locked up. The whole idea of exploitation of children is actually an extreme that made, because you saw the reaction to that. I was very pleased by the reaction by people who were saying, oh, hang on a minute. Why are you using that young girl? Why are you exploiting that young girl? Yep. And so these are the sorts of extremisms that I said earlier bring people to their senses and say, well, hang on a minute. You know, yeah, environment's a big issue, climate change is a big issue. But when you start exploiting children like that, no, you're going too far. There's something wrong with what's happening. But the other side of it is that the children in the schools didn't show the same response to her that the media and the public, a lot of the public wanted to see.
What about things like geoengineering? Now, it seems to me to be rather scary. It's a bit like fluoridation of the water supply, isn't it? Inflicting upon populations. Indeed, you know, I don't know the extent of geoengineering around the planet, but I know that it's a real phenomenon. I know that the Royal Society here in the UK, a very credible think tank, published a report on it in 2009, which I've got a copy of. It's not a conspiracy theory that people are already, you know, there are plans being laid to cool the planet and to combat what you and I might term a non-problem. Does this cause you a great deal of concern as well? Do you know much about the geoengineering agenda and so forth, Professor Ball?
Yes, I know a great deal about it, and have done an awful lot of research and written an awful lot on it. Of course, the minute that humans think that they can solve problems better than nature can, you know we're in trouble. And then the other thing is, if you don't know what you're doing, you're almost inevitably going to make it worse. So, for example, back when global cooling was the threat back in the 60s and 70s, there was all sorts of plans. They were going to put dust in the atmosphere and block the sunlight and cool the planet down. And they were going to put a bridge across the Bering Straits to stop the cold water from the Arctic Ocean going into the North Pacific. And that would, and all of these incredibly crazy schemes. There was even plans to launch huge, great reflectors up in space to reflect sunlight into northern cities to offset the cooling that was going on. And as I pointed out to people, you know, one of the plans was to increase CO2 in the atmosphere to offset the cooling. Now you're saying, we got too much. if you don't know what you're doing, you're almost certain to make things worse.
Yeah.
And so fortunately, at some point, people either won't spend the money, or as I talked about with the U.S. Senate, when they looked at the Kyoto Protocol and said, no, for the amount of money we've got to invest, the returns on that investment are not worth it. So the practicalities of socioeconomic measures, which are good, because when the politicians forced to do something, if they don't want to do it, they'll find a way around it, and that's what they've done with the environmental issues.
So, Professor Ball, are you an optimist in general with this issue? Do you think this issue is one that will ultimately reveal itself in as much as where is the climate disaster? Because we hear that there's an imminent climate disaster all the time. We know when we consult the record that actually things haven't got worse. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I've seen credible statistics showing that, for example, tornadoes are not increasing. That Atlantic hurricanes are not on the increase. There's a whole, ultimately, the pigeons come home to roost. The facts are around us in the environment. So you can't have an endless scare story, project that into the future with nothing happening. So do you think that's on our side?
Yeah. Yes. And the fact that they make all of these predictions and none of them come true. That's what I was talking about earlier. And you talk about, for example, forest fires in the Amazon. This is worse than ever. What was going on in the Amazon was that the president of Brazil, Bolsonaro, was causing trouble, and they wanted to get him out of office, so they blamed him for the forest fires. In fact, forest fires were at a 30-year low in Brazil, and that most of them were being set by peasants who were clearing land because the World Bank had given them funding to clear the land for agricultural base for Brazil. So my concern is, and environmentalism, just like feminism or any other new paradigm, it comes in, it has an impact, it sort of works its way out into logical, sensible things by people, and then they move on to another one. My concern is that the environment's slightly different. I mean, it's like as if feminism sort of went back to the old ways. You don't want that. You want to take the benefits of the new paradigm, but you need to work that out as to what they are. Well, that's what's happening with the environment. And my concern is as I said, that they'll throw the baby out with the bathwater, because you'll see that you won't get the storms they're predicting. In fact, we're already getting that now. And you're not going to get, in fact, what you're going to see is the opposite. You're going to see cooling. You saw the earliest skiing in Austria ever recorded. We're seeing it here in North America, skiing in the Cascades, a month ahead of normal levels. So the cooling is really going to knock this out of the picture. So that's why I think Mother Nature's taking care of it. Yep. My big concern is we need to be aware of those things, and but it's just that we've got to stop allowing these people to grab them and exploit them for their political or personal wealth objectives, and that's what goes on. Yeah.
And on the back of that, what would you advocate that people can do? What would be your call to action, if you like, for any listeners who are, I want to do something about this, on the side of truth and not just climate hysteria?
Well, of course, one thing is to be much more cynical about everything you hear, and people are growing that way. But the other thing that people need to be aware of, and it really has nothing to do with the environment, it has to do with changing politics. You see, up until about 1850, there were no political parties. There was leaders and there was followers. And that was the end of it. And then Marx wrote his book, and then Darwin wrote his book. So that was the introduction of the academic concepts of capitalism and socialism. over the next 100 years, those evolved into political parties. All right. And the political parties had sway. What you're seeing now is people are abandoning political parties. Right. People are saying, well, look, I'm conservative on some issues and socialist on others, but there's nothing to fit that. And so what you're left with is about 20% that are to the far left and 20% to the far right, and this 60% in the middle that are wandering around. And Trump took advantage of that. They said to Trump, well, which party you represent? And initially he didn't say. Finally, he said, well, okay, if you want one, it's Republican. But he isn't acting like a Republican. His legislation, in fact, is far more democratic. And you're seeing that in England now, that people are abandoning the concept of political parties, and they're into populism. What works for the majority of people? That's where we're at now. And so we're seeing a huge shift. And what will come with that, of course, is different perspectives on the environment and feminism and all the other issues that society deals with. Those will change because the politics of it are changing.
I'm always intrigued by the fact that populism is a word that's sort of bandied around us as an insult. If any leader appeals to populism, that's bad. But if you appeal to democracy, that's good. But hang on, isn't what's popular democratic?
Yeah.
Anyway,
of course.
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? Go on.
Well, as I said, all of these big paradigms of politics and political parties, and we're now into a completely different world. And it's partly because of the internet, of course, the access to information, which has never been available to the ordinary citizen before. And the control of information was done by a very few elite people. And even after the war, that continued. But at the minute the internet came in, suddenly this access to information and another view of things. But we've got to go through a phase where people have to learn to understand what the internet information is telling them. We need to teach our students in the school how to read and understand with discrimination.
Yeah.
Right. And analytical understandings. And those are the things that we're lacking right now. Now we'll catch up fairly quickly.
Yeah.
But all of this change, I think, gives me hope.
Yeah.
Because what you're going to end up with is we'll get away from the pure politics of it, the wealthy and the poor and all the rest of it, and we'll get into really what we need: get rid of politicians and have good leaders. And whether you like it or not, Trump is a leader. He's not a politician. And here's the difference: a leader. Somebody wants to find a leader as somebody who's willing to turn their back on the people. A politician would never do that. They're always catering to what the people are going to think or say. Therefore, they can never be a leader.
Yeah.
But society needs leaders. So what we're doing is we're going back 150 years to who are the leaders. The big difference is, of course, in those days, they were the aristocratic leaders, the ones that were born to it.
Yeah.
Now, of course, we can have leaders who just show natural leader ability.
Yeah.
So I think these are tremendously good changes that are going on.
Yeah, I share your optimism. I mean, I advocate. My website's all about encouraging people to think for themselves, and I think very important is to spot these logical fallacies because the idea of believing an idea just because everyone else does is really nonsense. And maybe if people can spot some of these ideas that the fact that an authority says something doesn't necessarily mean it's true. It may be, of course, but the buck stops with sort of reasoning. I think for ourselves. So I'm an optimist. I share your view that ultimately the truth will out. I mean, in terms of the environment and the climate, it's going to reveal itself, isn't it? Tomorrow is going to come.
There's another side of this, and that is probably close to 50% of the population don't even want to have to think or be involved. They're quite happy with being followers. Okay, I found this in the military. I'd have a group of men, and they're mumbling and groaning and so on, and finally I say, okay, we're going on a 20-mile route march. And after the route march, oh, what a great day! People need to be led and need to be directed. But how do you do that without having a dictatorial system? And that's the balance that we're really talking about here. So you're always going to have the 50% who are saying, well, there's graffiti in Pompeii that I just absolutely blew me away. And this is 2,000-year-old graffiti. And it says they were having an election at the time of Vesuvius eruption. And the graffiti says, if we get rid of this bunch of scoundrels, we just get another bunch of scoundrels. All right. So the people know that the quality of the leaders are going to vary, but overall, it really doesn't make any difference, And so they just tolerate bad leadership. That's what they do, and they get on with their lives. Now, obviously, because this is the interesting question, you see, why has Britain never had a revolution? Why have some countries had popular revolutions and others not? And the answer is because the British aristocracy were always smart enough to appear to give something away. Oh, well, you want to okay, we'll have a House of Parliament. We still got the House of Lords, don't worry about it. And you think you go own property, but six people own half of England. So there's always that. Whereas the French aristocrats were truly French, right? And so when the people said we want something, they said no, bugger off. And then the people said fine, we'll come and take it. And that's what revolutions are all about. By the way, I do happen to think that the people in England that wanted a popular revolution couldn't get it because the aristocrats just gave enough that they couldn't get a cohesive group together. So they went to America, and the American Revolution was actually the British Revolution. And it was against the monarchy. It was against the monarchy and the whole system. So I think that's how that worked out. But it's interesting.
Where could people best discover your work, Professor Paul? Can you give us some clues to where people can go to find out more?
Well, right now, because my website was very badly hacked, so I took the site down and we're trying to clean it up, and I hope to have it back up this week.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It'll be under drtimball.com. There's a backhanded compliment in this, by the way, because as the old wartime pilots used to say, when the flak's very heavy, you're over the target. So when you're hacking my website, I know I'm on the right track.
Indeed. And of course, any listeners or viewers might want to check out, I think you've got 2 books that you've written, Professor, The Deliberate Corruption of Climate Science being one of them, and also Human-Caused Global Warming, the biggest deception in history.
This is the one that, this one's more costly,
Mm-hmm.
but this one, and it's got all of the footnotes because I knew I was going to be attacked by the academics.
Yeah.
They'd find one little flaw and throw the whole book out, which is terrible. Yeah. But so this book is just a précis. It's 106 pages, and it answers the investigative journalism question. And that, by the way, how many investigative journalists are left in the world? Good ones. So the question, the why, what, where, when, and how. The book answers those questions for them in a way that the public can understand. Because one of the things that's happened with the environment is people that have exploited it for political gain knew that the public, 80% are art students. And so they made it deliberately scientific. And that's how they've gained control with it. Yeah. So I get attacked because the good Lord gave me the ability to explain complex things in ways that the public can understand.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've seen a few of your presentations and, wonderful clarity. I mean, I would say to anybody out there that, being an environmentalist is a good thing. I consider myself an environmentalist.
Sure. Oh, absolutely.
I think it's essential to take care of our own little patch. I have a small holding here. It's organically run. And we have to take care not to sort of shit on our own doorstep in every respect as a metaphor, and careful with all the things that we use. But at the same time, we have to think things through, and to get suckered into this idea that CO2 is bad news is really, really tragic. So I do hope people will take something from this discussion, Professor Ball, and hopefully come to gain some new insight from it.
And the beauty of it now is that the information is available to people. They don't have to rely on just what the authorities tell them. They can dig and get their own information. And what they should also do is push for the schools and the children to be taught how to read with discrimination and understanding, because I think that's the biggest problem, the indoctrination that's going on in the schools.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Professor Ball. Really appreciate your time. I'd urge you all to visit the website, lawfulrebel.com. There's loads more on there, interesting issues to help you take control of your life and thrive. Meanwhile, I do hope you'll join me once again for another episode of Living Outside the Matrix.
Change you want to see. Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see. Be